Thank you so much for inviting me to participate this morning. I really look forward to this opportunity and to hearing the discussion ahead. What I wanted to do this morning was to touch briefly on a historical perspective. The field of menopause has been my entire career, and so I feel that I've had the ability to witness the evolution of some of these things. As you mentioned, talk about the major outcomes from the Women's Health Initiative trials, and I was also asked to look at the current trends in the use of compounded hormones, to look at what we know about the clinical safety and utility of compounded hormones, and finally a note of comparison of the safety and utility of compounded hormones versus FDA-approved products. So fasten your seatbelts. I thought it would be helpful to look from a historical perspective first. And just to remind everyone that for those of you who may not have been familiar with this field, that in the 1980s and the early 1990s, there was literally a frenzy about the use of estrogen therapy to prevent heart disease, prevent osteoporosis, in women, and this was to the extent that the American College of Physicians recommended that all women should consider the use of hormone therapy. And so in the early 1990s, estrogen, or conjugated equine estrogen Premarin, was the most commonly prescribed drug in the United States. Not a statin, not a diabetes drug, but Premarin. And so I think wise individuals in this field said, we really should look at some of this in clinical trials because it's all been observational studies. So the PEPI study was an NIH-funded trial to look at heart disease risk factors, blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar, and somebody had the prescience to include not only conjugated equine estrogens with medroxyprogesterone acetate, the most commonly prescribed progestin at that time, but said, why don't we look at what happens with micronized progesterone? This was really brilliant, except for the fact that micronized progesterone was not an FDA-approved drug in the United States. So when the PEPI trial came out and said, this looks like the most promising combination with estrogen for the best cardiovascular risk profile, clinicians were at a loss. And to my mind, that is the point when people really started looking in earnest at working with compounding pharmacies because they wanted to be able to use micronized progesterone in the years before it was commercially available. The HERS trial was a study looking at women with heart disease, the same conjugated equine estrogens and medroxyprogesterone acetate. And in 1998, HERS told us that this was not going to work. It didn't help. These women had a higher incidence of heart disease. And so again, the articles, if you look at the publications at that time, should he use micronized progesterone? Should he use micronized progesterone? And so again, the frenzy was kind of building for getting to this product. Well, the WHI was well underway by the time these other two trials came out. And so because these were the most commonly prescribed hormones, the use of conjugated equine estrogens and medroxyprogesterone acetate were the two products in the WHI. And the rest, as they say, is history. But the WHI was the largest, longest NIH-funded clinical trial in women's health with about 26,000 women participating. So this is huge. This is like the cardiovascular studies. And there were two main arms of the WHI depending on whether or not women had a uterus. So if you had a uterus, you required the medroxyprogesterone acetate. There were about 16,000 women in that arm. If you didn't have a uterus, you were okay to use estrogen alone. And in that arm, there were about 10,000 women. And the results of the first arm, the combination arm of the WHI, came out in 2002. I like to say that this was the shot heard round the world from the standpoint of women's health and hormone therapy, because we were promoting clinicians and experts in women's health were promoting hormones for prevention of heart disease. And the results from the Women's Health Initiative, which included women from ages 50 to 79, said that the risks exceeded the benefits, that heart disease, stroke, venous thromboembolism in the way of cardiovascular events, and breast cancer were all increased. And so as you might imagine, this led to several actions in different spheres. One was within the FDA, and they responded very promptly to require package labeling changes. I think this was considered a serious safety issue that we had been unaware of within months. They re-looked at the indications for therapy, honing that these would be for primarily treatment of symptoms in the way of hot flashes, lowest dose and shortest time, some of the vaginal symptoms that women can experience after menopause, but if those were her primary symptoms, use local therapies. And finally, the only prevention indication was for osteoporosis in women who either weren't appropriate candidates or hadn't tolerated osteoporosis medications that were already FDA approved at that time. But the real clincher that I think had an impact on clinicians and certainly on women were the new boxed warnings that were, again, put in there to warn about these frightening new findings, that hormones increase the risk for heart disease, didn't prevent it, and breast cancer. And again, emphasizing that these were not approved for prevention, even though in the past the FDA had gotten quite close to including a prevention indication. But the other clincher is that similar label changes are requested for other manufacturers, not just those of Premarin and Provera, but for all manufacturers of hormone therapy because all products are believed to have similar risks. I think this is a very prescient comment that all products are perceived to have similar risks. So the other sphere that we saw a big change was just in the world of menopause, an incredible drop in both the use and prescriptions of hormone therapy. This was almost immediate. But the WHI did carry on, and the WHI continued with a total of 13-year follow-up. This was really helpful for us as clinicians because the results of this 13-year follow-up were able to give us in absolute risks and benefits just how many events really occurred per 1,000 women in the age that had been established should be using hormone therapy, 50 to 59, per 5 years. So when you're sitting across the desk from a woman, you could say, I know you've heard that there's a 27% increased risk of breast cancer. How this really translated was 3 additional cases per 1,000 women per 5 years of use. And some women would say, I can't possibly take that risk. And other women would say, I don't get why there was such a fuss. This doesn't seem like much to me. So we get that women have very individualized perspectives on these things. The other thing the WHI was continue follow-up for 18 years since the initiation of the study with the question of, is there an impact of the hormones that were studied and used in the Women's Health Initiative on mortality? Did these risks that we had initially heard about actually lead to any mortality? So again, I'm just showing you the data from women ages 50 to 59, the group that is encouraged to use hormone therapy. And you can see that the points are falling to the left of the vertical line. What that tells us is that there's certainly no increase, and if anything, there are some who would argue that there may be a mortality benefit, at least for estrogen alone. I don't think this is widely agreed upon, but we don't see an increase in death from the use of hormones. Nevertheless, the flight from prescription FDA-approved hormone therapy has continued. This is looking through 2009, both in the prevalence, meaning whether or not women continued therapy they were already prescribed, or in incidence in women starting for the first time. And the most recent report was generated, as best I can tell, through the FDA that looked from the decade, moving this out a little more currently from 2006 to 2015, and showing just in that time an additional 50% reduction. Well, the number of postmenopausal women is increasing year by year, and so that's a lot of untreated women for vasomotor symptoms unless they're getting their treatment somewhere else. So this brings us to the question of current trends in the use of compounded hormone therapy. We know that women are using a lot of it, and we know that more prescriptions are being written, and I'm going to show you just some of that data. But in contrast to the kind of graphs I could show you for FDA-approved prescription therapies, we don't have a tracking mechanism for compounded therapies. These are monitored by their state pharmacy boards, and I suspect that some of the larger groups certainly monitor their prescriptions and their sales data, but that's not open access, and so we really don't know. But there have been a number of surveys that we have tried to get a feel for this. So there are 3 groups that were surveyed: pharmacists, patients, and then providers, physicians. The pharmacy survey came up with the idea that between 26 and 33 million prescriptions annually are written for compounded therapies, and the total sales estimated between 1.3 and 1.6 billion. Patient surveys indicate that between 1 to 2.5 million over the age of 40 are using compounded therapies, and that between a quarter and 2/3 of all prescriptions filled annually may be for compounded drugs, again with revenues of $1 to $2 billion. So we're not talking about a cottage industry. We're talking about a very major effort and availability and use by a lot of women. The other thing is that looking at which physicians may be more likely to write for these, I think there's a broad spectrum, but this survey found that more wellness physicians than others would use this. And we looked at this within NAMS and found in our survey, the North American Menopause Society, that about 10% of women were taking menopause hormone therapy, and of those, a third were using BHT. What was interesting to look at was that when we looked in the older women by age, these were women who probably had started on FDA-approved therapies and were more likely to continue those. But when we looked towards the younger women, you could see an increase such that women in their 40s, I don't think it's going to be too long before this reaches equity, where as many women are using compounded therapies as using FDA-approved therapies. So why does this happen? People will often ask me, why do women do this? So I was very intrigued to find this recent article that really was describing some findings from very detailed, extensive interviews of women in 2007 and 2008. So sometime in the past, and they talked about the push and pull that women feel, and I thought this was kind of insightful. They talked about a push away from conventional, meaning FDA-approved therapies, because of fear about the safety, because they found that the concept of using an estrogen product that was generated from pregnant mare's urine was unsavory in particular, and from a sense of distrust to the medical community, which and the pharmaceutical industry, which I often find a little bit disappointing, but I can see how a lot of us felt fooled when these results initially came out. The pull toward compounding therapies is because it effectively helps their symptoms. They perceive that these are safer, and because they're looking for individualized or customized treatment, right? We do other customized therapies, why not with our hormones as well? And the clinical experience they described with the time the compounding pharmacists would spend with them was helpful. So there's no question that compounding is an important role for patients who don't tolerate FDA-approved therapies. For example, early on we learned that because peanut oil is used in FDA-approved progesterone capsules, a woman with a peanut allergy, for example, is going to require a compounded product. I mentioned to you about following PEPI. We just didn't have FDA-approved micronized progesterone in our formularies yet, and so because of requirement for a unique formulation. And I think in today's world, the best example of not having something in our formulary is for testosterone. We currently do not have an FDA-approved therapy for women, and to my understanding, a lot of the compounding products will include testosterone and DHEA, which women seem to appreciate. I tried to find some sort of clinical trials or data, and I thought that this was an effective way to convey from the AHRQ that looks very critically and evidence-based at what we know about this. And they simply state there's insufficient evidence regarding safety and efficacy. We were unable to identify any clinical trials comparing compounding hormone therapy due to growing interest and increase of prescriptions. Research in this area should be given a priority. They went on to say that claims regarding safety, efficacy, and superiority, they just could not find support in the medical literature and the traditional kind of evidence that we look for. And they commented that the FDA had voiced some concern about some of these claims in the absence of data. So what are we looking for? What are we concerned about? And this has been published by a number of medical groups. The lack of evidence supporting claims, one thing. Concerns with uniform dosing, monitoring by salivary hormone determinations, inconsistencies in manufacturing standards and state regulatory oversight. Appreciating that I think there are a number very high quality, but there have been some lapses. I think we would all agree on that. Concerns with product contamination or impurities. And finally, the lack of patient package inserts as required by the FDA. This, in my mind, is perhaps one of the areas of confusion for patients when they don't see those boxed warnings. So what are the areas that I'm aware of from the standpoint of safety? One kind of came up as a surprise, and there certainly were issues related to some of the cutaneous estrogen products and testosterone, that these could inadvertently be conveyed to small children. And I got an interesting call from our veterinary group at the University of California, looking at asking if, as the president of the North American Menopause Society, was I aware of any transfer of hormones to small animals, because their vets were reporting animals coming in with issues. Sometimes these animals would go back for repeat surgery because they thought these animals had been neutered, and in fact they were coming in with genital enlargement, nipple enlargement, and it turned out when they looked at it that either it was being transferred to them through the skin or they were licking some of these cutaneous hormones. And the standard of more general medical concerns, I feel like we're a little bit having a deja vu moment back to the 1970s when we realized that the use of conjugated equine estrogens without a progestin could increase cancer of the uterus. And again, these are from survey findings, case reports. We don't have large series or large outcome data that show us this, but there are concerns with whether or not the possibility of endometrial cancer could be increased in this era when women are using more compounded products than FDA-approved products, which are required to have 1 year of endometrial safety with any approval, and whether or not the adverse event reporting is something that could possibly be more helpful. This was looking at recent data just from population data, looking at the rate of endometrial cancer overall, showing that it was constant in the decade, really following PEPI when we started using medroxyprogesterone acetate. But the lower graph is taking a blow up of what's in that upper box for the years 2006 to 2012, where there's been a 10% increase in endometrial cancer. So why is this happening? Is this related to the shift in the way hormones are being prescribed and used? Could this possibly also relevant to the increase in obesity and diabetes in our population? But again, something that I think merits more examination. The other thing, when we start looking at comparison of FDA-approved products with compounded, is the fact that in our surveys, between 10% and half of women mistakenly think that their compounded therapies are FDA approved. Like, why wouldn't they be? My doctor writes a prescription, I go to a pharmacy. What do you mean it's not FDA approved? How can that be? And 3/4 of respondents were uncertain, and in some surveys, clinicians aren't even necessarily certain. So could, again, this lack of a patient package insert regarding the risks, which again would be expected to be similar to those of FDA-approved hormones, contribute to the lack of awareness and a false sense of safety that patients seem to tell us about? And so Dr. Joanne Manson and I just posed this in a perspective piece in JAMA Internal Medicine about 1.5 years ago, and just said, is this a little bit of a regulatory double standard, and might this be posing a negative for women? There are a number of bioidentical, if you will, meaning similar chemical composition, FDA-approved products, oral therapies, cutaneous therapies, bioidentical progesterone, and a new combination therapy, all FDA-approved, meaning clinical trials demonstrating efficacy, clinical trials demonstrating endometrial safety, just two of the key concerns. So our group, when we did the Endocrine Society guidelines, along with any number of groups that have long-standing commitment to the wellness of women, recommended that patients use FDA-approved therapies versus compounded therapies. In fact, this article, which is some years back now, is an opinion statement from the Women's Health Practice and Research Network of the American College of Clinical Pharmacy, really spoke along the same lines. Based on an analysis of research, they endorsed the position statements of other organizations stating there is insufficient evidence to support the safety or efficacy of compounded products over traditional hormone therapy products, and that these really could not be recommended as part of a standard practice. So in summary, and I thank you for your attention and patience, from the historical perspective, we often talk about the WHI being the pivotal point when we started using compounded hormones, but I really think it goes back earlier, and I think we can date it even into the mid-1990s, which means we're, probably 25 years or so into this arena now. Hormone therapy currently is indicated primarily to treat symptoms of menopause. I told you that there was an indication in some circumstances for prevention of osteoporosis, but not for prevention of heart disease, and certainly not for prevention of breast cancer. Surveys tell us that there's a lot of compounded hormones out there, and that this is a very big business. And I feel, again, that there is just an absence of clinical trials for safety or efficacy of these agents, to the best of my ability to look at the medical literature about this. And both product package labeling, I think, would at least inform women that the risks of all products are considered to be the same. The package labeling would let them know that compounded therapies were not FDA approved. And finally, I think it would be really helpful if we could have a more consistent, consolidated, and transparent adverse event reporting mechanism, so we could really go to one place and look at this. So with that, I thank you for your attention and conclude my remarks. Thank you.